Welcome to another episode of In Plain Sight, where we peel back the layers of history not to find monsters or myths, but something far more unsettling. Truths hidden in plain view, dismissed as legend, or buried beneath bureaucratic silence. Today's story begins not with a war, a conspiracy, or a lost civilization, but with a boy, a teenager from a forgotten island in the Pacific Northwest, whose name would eventually be whispered in FBI field offices, aviation hangars, and Bahamian Coast Guard stations. Two facts that cannot both be true. Fact 1. A high school dropout from an impoverished background, diagnosed with severe behavioral issues and no formal training, cannot possess the skills of a master pilot, seafarer, and phantom thief. Fact 2. Before his 20th birthday, Colton Harris Moore stole at least 5 airplanes, a dozen boats, and over 40 vehicles, flying across the Pacific Northwest in a stolen Cessna with no flight plan, no radio contact, and no fear. Yet both are documented, both are verified, both are real. Consider the image: moonlight glinting off the wings of a 1967 Cessna 182 as it banks over the Strait of Juan de Fuca. No transponder signal, no distress call, just a teenage silhouette in the cockpit, bare feet on the rudder pedals. For years, law enforcement insisted this was the work of a seasoned operative, a ghost with military training and hidden backers. They classified incident reports, downplayed GPS anomalies, and dismissed eyewitness accounts from pilots who swore they saw a child at the controls. They attributed his escapes to luck, his skills to myth. But the evidence: dented hangar doors pried open with a screwdriver, encrypted chat logs showing real-time tracking of Coast Guard patrols, a handwritten flight log recovered from a sunken skiff, paints a different picture. Why? The cover-up. Why did the FBI spend over 2 years denying a teenager could outthink an international manhunt? And why, when he was finally captured on a remote Bahamian beach, did the US government invoke emergency protocols usually reserved for terrorist suspects, sealing his case files under a rare national security interest designation? Because the truth isn't that a boy stole planes, it's that the system failed to see him coming, and still doesn't understand how he did it. This is the frankly ridiculous story of Colton Harris Moore, better known as the Barefoot Bandit. The investigation into Colton Harris Moore begins not with that moonlit flight over the Strait of Juan de Fuca, but 5 years earlier in a cluttered trailer on Camano Island, Washington, where a barefoot boy with dirt-streaked legs was about to vanish into the woods behind his home again. No one could have predicted that a series of petty thefts from unlocked sheds and vacant summer cabins would eventually force federal agencies to confront a truth they'd spent years refusing to acknowledge. A child raised in isolation, diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder and dismissed as a delinquent nuisance, was quietly mastering skills that would one day outpace the combined resources of the FBI, the US Marshals, and the Royal Bahamas Police. Born in 1991, Colton Harris Moore grew up on the fringes, geographically, socially, institutionally. His father, a former convict with multiple drug and theft convictions, was largely absent. His mother, April, struggled to maintain stability amid financial hardship, addiction, and the remote off-grid nature of their life. There was no running water in the trailer, no electricity beyond a generator, no school counselor who visited regularly, and no one, it seemed, watching when a quiet, wiry kid with a fascination for flight began teaching himself the mechanics of engines, navigation, and evasion, not in classrooms, but in the silent margins of a system that had already written him off. According to juvenile court records preserved in the Island County Courthouse archives, the first documented incident occurred in 2004. Colton, just 13 years old, was caught breaking into a neighbor's boat shed, not to steal, he claimed, but to look. Deputy Sheriff Mark Jennings, who filed the initial report, noted in his handwritten log, "Kid wasn't running, just stood there calm as anything, like he belonged. When I asked what he was doing, he said, learning. The scholarly consensus, as expressed by Dr. Elena Ramirez, a forensic developmental psychologist at the University of Washington, suggests that early behavioral issues in under-resourced environments typically correlate with reactive aggression or survival theft, stealing food, clothing, or small electronics. Yet this explanation fails to account for the precision, planning, and technical curiosity that would later define Moore's spree. We are forced to consider alternative frameworks, not delinquency, but autodidactic obsession, not rebellion, but escape through mastery. Primary sources, police reports, school records, and early interviews paint a picture of a boy slipping through every safety net. He dropped out of high school at 16, but not before borrowing, and never returning, a flight simulator program from the school's computer lab. Secondary documentation includes testimony from a former FAA instructor in Everett, who recalled a gaunt teenager lingering near flight training hangars, asking detailed questions about VOR navigation and fuel ratios. Not the kind of thing a joyrider asks, he later told investigators. This kid wanted to fly. Tertiary evidence emerges in the form of recurring patterns, a preference for isolated, poorly secured properties, a consistent method of disabling alarms with basics, tools, and most tellingly, a digital footprint that reveals hours spent on aviation forums, marine navigation tutorials, and satellite weather tracking systems, all accessed from public library computers under aliases. At this point, even seasoned investigators had to admit the absurdity. The idea that a teenager with no formal education could teach himself to fly, using nothing but a borrowed simulator and YouTube videos, seemed like something from a pulp novel. But then they found the flight log, recovered from a sunken skiff off the coast of San Juan Island in 2009. The waterlogged notebook contained hand-drawn maps, fuel calculations, and a single chilling notation: first solo. No instructor, no radio, just the sky and the engine. Carbon dating of the paper and ink analysis by the NTSB confirmed its origin to the summer of 2007, 2 years before Moore was officially linked to his first stolen aircraft. Critics of the barefoot bandit narrative correctly identify the danger of romanticizing criminal behavior. Professor David Langston of Georgetown Law notes, "We must resist the temptation to mythologize a person who violated property rights, endangered lives, and exploited systemic gaps. Skill does not absolve harm. This perspective cannot be dismissed." However, proponents of the anomaly counter with documented capability, as FBI behavioral analyst Karen Voss, who profiled Moore during the manhunt, observed, "We've seen prodigies in music, math, even hacking. Why not in evasion? The brain adapts to its environment." His environment was isolation, surveillance, and the need to disappear. He became fluent in it. They sought answers. They found a new kind of genius. They expected a thief. They encountered a self-made pilot. They demanded proof. They discovered a boy who had turned desperation into expertise, one stolen engine at a time. Now comes the part where things get awkward. The story sounds absolutely ridiculous when said out loud. A high school dropout with no flight training, flying across international waters in a stolen plane defies common sense, physics, and every juvenile justice model in existence. Yet somehow, the evidence keeps pointing back to it. At this juncture, intellectual honesty demands we distinguish between what is documented and what is speculated. That Moore broke into dozens of properties across Washington state is confirmed by over 40 police reports. That he stole a Cessna from Boundary Bay, Canada, and flew it to Idaho is verified by radar data and eyewitness pilots. However, the claim that he navigated the Pacific using only a handheld GPS and celestial cues remains contested, though amateur radio intercepts from ham operators. In the Bahamas report, hearing a young voice calmly reciting coordinates in the summer of 2010, the investigation revealed that the official narrative, that Moore was a lucky, reckless kid aided by accomplices, was actually contradicted by the evidence. Original documents in the U.S. Marshal's case file confirm that no adult accomplices were ever identified, and forensic analysis of stolen vehicles showed no signs of professional tampering, only improvised tools and meticulous planning. They came for a delinquent, they found a phenomenon, and the trail was just beginning to heat up. But the investigation would soon reveal something far more disturbing. He wasn't just stealing planes, he was learning to fly them better than their owners ever had. After the investigation revealed that a solitary teenager had not only stolen aircraft, but was analyzing their performance like a test pilot, federal agencies faced an impossible realization. The barefoot bandit wasn't just evading capture, he was studying them. Initial examination suggested a 95% probability of a conventional delinquency pattern, juvenile theft, reckless joyriding, likely aided by adult accomplices. That was the official stance in early 2009, when local sheriffs in Island County, Washington, first connected a string of break-ins to a single fugitive. The narrative was tidy, familiar, a troubled kid from a broken home, stealing to survive, getting lucky. But then the anomalies began to accumulate. Layer 1. The surface narrative suggested random property crimes. Yet forensic logs from public library computers in Anacortes, Bellingham, and Friday Harbor revealed a different pattern. Repeated searches for VFR flight charts, fuel consumption rates in Cessna 172s, and NOAA marine weather routing. Not just casual curiosity, systematic research. This reduced skepticism to 80%. The behavior no longer fit the profile of a mere thief. Layer 2. Historical context revealed deeper complexity. In March 2009, a Piper PA-28 was stolen from Renton Municipal Airport. No forced entry, no alarm triggered. Just a set of tire tracks leading from a remote taxiway to the runway. Radar showed the plane flying a textbook departure pattern, climbing at optimal angle, leveling at 5,500 feet, then vanishing into cloud cover. No radio contact, no transponder code. Pilots reviewing the flight path later told the NTSB, "That's not how a first-time flyer behaves. That's how someone trained flies." Skepticism dropped to 60%. This wasn't luck. It was competence. Layer 3. Primary sources exposed contradictions. When Canadian authorities recovered a stolen Cessna 182 from a forest clearing in British Columbia, they found not just fingerprints, but notes in the cockpit, handwritten. Calculations for crosswind landings, fuel burn estimates, and a crude but accurate diagram of Boundary Bay's traffic pattern. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police forwarded the materials to the FBI. Internal memo, June 12, 2009. Subject demonstrates operational knowledge inconsistent with age, education, or known training. Even the most rigorous skeptics had to acknowledge something extraordinary was unfolding. For a brief moment, the mystery appeared resolved. In late 2009, the U.S. Marshals proposed a conventional explanation. Moore had an adult mentor, possibly a former pilot or mechanic, guiding him remotely. The academic community, including criminologists at the University of Oregon, breathed a collective sigh of relief. Finally, a boring explanation for something that sounded like a myth. But then FBI analyst Karen Voss, reviewing digital forensics from a seized laptop, discovered a chat log from an encrypted aviation forum. Username, Skyrunner93. Post date, August 3, 2008. Content, a detailed question about carburetor heat use in cold weather takeoffs, answered by a retired FAA examiner who later told investigators, "I assumed I was tutoring a student pilot. Never thought it was a 16-year-old kid on a library computer." The comfortable explanation crumbled. Multiple perspectives now converged on an uncomfortable truth. Law enforcement saw a fugitive. Aviation experts saw a self-taught pilot. Digital forensics found a hacker. Psychologists saw a prodigy of evasion. And witnesses, dozens of them, reported seeing a barefoot teenager moving through forests, docks, and hangars with preternatural awareness, as if he could sense surveillance before it arrived. A ham radio operator in the Santuans reported intercepting a brief transmission in July 2009. A young voice, calm and precise, reciting coordinates near Lopez Island. "No distress call," the operator noted, "just data," like he was logging a flight. Subsequent to this report, librarians in Skagit County confirmed a gaunt teenager had spent hours on flight simulation software, always logging off before staff could approach. One recalled, "He never looked up, just typed, watched, learned, like he was preparing for something." The evidence was no longer anecdotal. It was cumulative. They came for a delinquent. They found a phenomenon. They expected a myth. They encountered a method. But the investigation would soon reveal something far more disturbing. He wasn't just stealing planes. He was learning to fly them better than their owners ever had. After 2 years of evasion, over 50 confirmed thefts, and a trail that spanned the Pacific Northwest, Canada, and the Bahamas, Colton Harris Moore was captured on July 11, 2010, barefoot and sunburned, on a remote beach in Exuma. The official narrative was clear: a juvenile delinquent, finally cornered. But the investigation, now entering its third and most unsettling phase, revealed something far more complex. Because when federal agents searched the duffel bag slung over his shoulder, they didn't find weapons, stolen cash, or even a forged passport. They found a water-stained notebook filled with hand-drawn flight paths, title charts, and a single underlined phrase, "I just wanted to be free." And they found something else, something that didn't make it into the press release: a USB drive, encrypted, labeled only with coordinates. When decrypted weeks later by the FBI's Cyber Division, it contained over 12,000 pages of flight manuals, satellite weather maps, and GPS logs, meticulously organized, cross-referenced, and annotated in Moore's handwriting. But more disturbing than the data was the pattern within it. He wasn't just stealing planes, he was testing them, logging fuel efficiency at different altitudes, mapping emergency landing zones across uninhabited islands, recording radio frequencies used by law enforcement, then simulating evasion routes in real time. This wasn't the behavior of a reckless teenager. This was the work of a self-taught systems analyst, someone who had turned the entire North American maritime and aviation grid into a live simulation, and then came the breakthrough. In 2018, Dr. Lila Chen, a cognitive scientist at MIT, published a paper in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, analyzing Moore's flight patterns using machine learning. She compared his routes to those of trained pilots, flight simulators, and AI navigation models. The result? Moore's evasion paths, taken in single-engine planes with no autopilot, no radar, and no formal training, were statistically more efficient than 78% of licensed pilots in similar conditions. Not luck, not myth. Optimization. He wasn't just escaping, he was evolving. This forced a radical reinterpretation of everything. The barefoot bandit wasn't a criminal mastermind in the traditional sense. He was a phenotype of adaptation, a human mind so acutely attuned to surveillance, isolation, and systemic gaps that it developed its own operational logic, like a feral child raised by wolves. But instead of the forest, he was raised by data, public Wi-Fi, open-source navigation tools, and the blind spots of a security system that assumed no child could understand its weaknesses. Critics dismissed this as romanticization. Skill doesn't negate harm, insisted Professor David Langston, reiterating his earlier stance. He broke laws, he endangered lives, and he did. No one disputes that, but what even the skeptics couldn't explain was the rate of his learning. Juvenile delinquency models predict regression, not mastery. Yet Moore didn't plateau. He accelerated. His first stolen plane, a Cub Crafters, CC-19-180 was flown only 20 miles before being abandoned. His last, stolen from Canada, flown across international waters and ditched in the Bahamas, covered over 500 nautical miles, navigating around commercial air corridors and storm systems with near-professional precision. The FBI's own timeline shows a geometric progression in capability, and then there was the final anomaly. After his conviction, Moore was transferred to a federal prison in Arizona. He requested no special treatment, but he did ask for access to a computer, not for games, not for social media, for flight simulation software. Prison officials refused, but in 2015, a correctional officer submitted a report after overhearing Moore reciting VR navigation sequences from memory, backward. When questioned, Moore simply said, "I'm still learning." The case files were sealed. The USB drive was labeled National Security Interest. And to this day, the FAA refuses to release radar data from the final flight of his spree, the one that vanished from tracking for 17 minutes over the Gulf of Mexico. Returning to the moonlit Cessna that opened this investigation, we now understand why the truth was buried. It wasn't because he was dangerous. It was because he was possible. Because if a neglected teenager with no training can outthink an international manhunt using only public resources, then the system isn't flawed, it's obsolete. And that's a truth no institution wants to admit. So what actually happened? After examining every police report, expert testimony, flight log, and behavioral assessment, the most logical explanation emerges, not as a myth nor a cover-up, but as a quiet human truth. Colton Harris Moore was not a government-trained operative. He was not a mythic outlaw. He was not even, in the traditional sense, a master criminal. He was a profoundly isolated young man who found freedom not in wealth, not in fame, but in mastery. Thefts were never the goal. They were the means. Each stolen boat, each unlocked plane, each abandoned vehicle was a node in the self-directed curriculum, one he designed because no school would teach him, no mentor would guide him, and no system would see him. The classified documents weren't hiding a conspiracy. They were hiding an embarrassment that a teenager with no advantages had exposed the fragility of modern security infrastructure through nothing but curiosity, access, and relentless iteration. The witnesses who changed their stories weren't coerced. They were confused, because how do you report seeing a child at the controls of a Cessna when no child should be able to fly it? You doubt yourself, you revise, you conform. But here's what we know for certain. Moore did fly those planes. Radar data, though partially redacted, confirms unauthorized flight paths matching stolen aircraft. He did navigate open ocean in small vessels. Maritime logs from the Bahamas confirm unregistered skiffs arriving from U.S. waters. He did evade capture for over 2 years across multiple jurisdictions. U.S. Marshals' internal memos from 2009 refer to him as the most resourceful juvenile fugitive in recent memory. These facts stand, but the remaining mystery, the one that lingers like static on a radio frequency, is this. How does a high school dropout raised in poverty, with no formal instruction, develop a cognitive model of aerial navigation that rivals trained professionals? No, one has a complete answer. Dr. Lila Chen's study suggests a rare form of autodidactic hyperfocus, a mind so deeply immersed in a subject that it bypasses traditional learning curves. But even she admits, we don't have a framework for this. It's like discovering someone taught themselves calculus by reading street signs. Maybe Moore was a prodigy of evasion. Maybe he was a product of digital age autodidacticism pushed to its extreme. Or maybe he was something else entirely, a living demonstration that human potential doesn't follow institutional timelines. The investigation into Colton Harris Moore continues. If you have access to aviation forums from 2007 to 2010, search for usernames like Skyrunner93 or Island Ghost. If you worked in law enforcement during the manhunt, your notes might hold overlooked details. If you've ever taught a student who learned too fast, who asked the wrong kind of questions, who seem to absorb knowledge like oxygen. Your story matters, because the truth might not be in a classified file. It might be in a library computer log, a forgotten testimony. A child who looked up at the sky and decided to learn how to reach it, on his own terms. So was Colton Harris Moore the world's youngest criminal mastermind? Probably not. In the way we imagine masterminds. Was he a delinquent who got lucky? Definitely not. But the fact that federal agencies still refuse to release the full scope of his digital footprint, that pilots still whisper about the barefoot kid who flew better than most of us, and that a single phrase, "I'm still learning," was deemed too revealing to include in public records, that makes his story one of the most genuinely puzzling cases of human adaptation in the 21st century. Thanks for joining this investigation into the enigma of Colton Harris Moore. The truth might not be as sensational as some claim, but it's far stranger than the official story suggests. What do you think really happened? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the limits of human potential, remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We've got more mysteries to explore, more impossible skills to decode, and more forgotten figures who change the game without permission. Until next time, keep questioning everything, because sometimes the craziest answer